So today I want to talk to you a little bit about virtual moral wrongs. So things that might be morally wrong when they're performed in a video game. So we're going to talk a lot about virtual murder. So let's talk a little bit about definitions first and what murder is. So first we need to make a distinction between murder and killing. Killing is the ending of a life. So, for example, you can kill grass, a mouse, or a human being. Killing in itself is morally neutral. For example, killing a plant is morally neutral, generally speaking. Maybe there's contexts where killing a plant is wrong, but for the most part, morally neutral. Even some killing of human beings is morally permissible. So, for example, in self-defense, presumably that's morally permissible, and sometimes even maybe required. You could imagine maybe we have a requirement: if you could kill Hitler before he slaughtered 6 million Jews, you have an obligation to do it. So killing can, in most cases, I think even in most cases, is morally neutral and permissible. In some cases, it's prohibited. In some cases, it's obligatory. But so killing can really go either way. If you want to talk about this sort of act without taking a stance on whether it's morally right or wrong, talking in terms of killing is the way to go. Talk of murder is different. Murder is a killing that is morally wrong. So to know if a killing is a murder, we must first settle whether that killing was morally prohibited. Like, talking about abortion being murder, for example, begs the question. It already assumes the conclusion. Abortion is undisputably a killing, but so is mowing your lawn. So killing is not necessarily wrong. Murder is necessarily wrong. Murder is when killing is wrong. That's not very helpful because, the definition of murder, to say murder is killing that is wrong, it leaves out the crucial part of that definition, which is, well, when is killing wrong? Like, what is wrong? When are things wrong? And in particular, when is killing wrong? So it's a little difficult to tell. You can't just depend on the definition of murder to figure out whether you should kill something or not, or whether you're permitted to kill something or not, because to understand murder, you have to already understand all of morality to be able to tell whether a particular killing is morally wrong or not. Okay, let's talk about virtual murder. So, as we're going to understand virtual murder, killing in video games, a player commits an act of virtual murder in those cases where he directs his character to kill another in circumstances that, were the game an actual environment, the actions of his character would constitute an actual murder. So, if I'm playing Grand Theft Auto and I'm bored and I'm screwing around in the streets and I decide to walk up to a civilian and shoot him in the head, if I did that in real life, that would be a murder. Just because shooting somebody in the head because I was bored on the streets of DC, that would be a murder. I'm doing that in the video game, so we're going to call that virtual murder. And the question is, or one of the questions we're going to be worried about is there anything wrong with doing the virtual murder? I mean, I'm taking an act which is wrong to do in real life. Is there anything wrong doing it virtually? Some notable things that we should leave out of our thinking when we think about virtual murder is we should think about it in terms of things like Grand Theft Auto, when you walk up to a stranger and kill them on the street because you're bored, or run them over just driving down the streets, having fun running over civilians, which is a common occurrence when you play Grand Theft Auto. We don't mean to talk about two sorts of cases. One is wartime video games, right? Often killing in wartime we might think is justified. So it's not murder. It's a killing. It's not a murder. It's not necessary. I mean, it's debatable. We have to have a whole conversation about the morality of killing in wartime. But it's at least a cloudy issue whether killing in wartime is murder or not. It's probably not. It's probably a justified killing. So at least in many instances. So we're not going to talk about Battlefield 1942. We're not going to talk about Call of Duty. We're not going to talk about any sort of video game which involves killing in the context of possibly justified killing. We're also not going to talk about games like Pac-Man. If you said, Pac-Man's killing these ghosts, if he was doing that in real life, would it be a murder? I don't know what the real life equivalent of Pac-Man is. It is such an abstract game. The very idea that he's killing these ghosts is very unclear if that's what's really happening. Any sort of game which is so abstract where we naturally want to talk about, well, this character kills that character and then the game progresses. Like Pac-Man, right? We talk about, well, you need to kill all the ghosts and not let them kill you while you're eating the pegs. I mean, fine, we use the word killing, but it's so abstract and disconnected from real life. It's not clear whether this is an act of killing. It's definitely not clear. There's no way for me to think about the analogy of Pac-Man in real life. So Pac-Man, totally outside of the conversation about virtual murder. Wartime video games, also totally outside of the context of virtual murder. What we're really focused on are games like Grand Theft Auto, right? Where there's a very clear analog to real life. You're going around and killing civilians on the street for fun, which if you did in real life would be morally wrong. So there's an analogy, and the analogy is to an action in real life which is clearly a wrong killing, that is a murder. Is there anything wrong with murdering people in video games? I think if you're like me, if you're like most people, you would say there's nothing wrong with that. People play Grand Theft Auto all the time. Very normal people, like millions and millions of perfectly normal, perfectly adequately adjusted people, perfectly good people play Grand Theft Auto at the end of the day, and they fuck around and they drive on the sidewalks and they run people over. It doesn't seem to us that virtual murder is wrong in any way. Keep that thought in mind, because we're going to move on and we're going to pose problems with that thought. Okay, so virtual pedophilia, we'll define this similar to how we defined virtual murder. A player commits an act of virtual pedophilia in those cases where she directs her character to molest another in circumstances such that were the game environment actual, her character would be deemed a pedophile. So games in which not like Pac-Man, so it can't be like a pedophilia game, which is like so abstract and weirdly disconnected from real life. It has to have some sort of like I am working at a grocery store and the goal of the game is to trick a child to go to the back room with me and then perform, it has to have some sort of analogy with real life, and the real life act that I'm playing out in the game needs to be a morally wrong one. In particular, it needs to be an act of pedophilia. There are many games like this. So there's a game called Rape-Lay, which the goal of the game and sort of the enticement of playing the game, it's not a very fun game as far as competition goes, as far as I understand. It's more that the game is edgy and that you get to play a game where you're seducing young children to have sex with you. That would be a pedophilic act, a morally wrong act in real life. So the question is there any sort of wrongness in performing it virtually in games like Rape-Lay? Our focus is not going to be online gaming with other players. That introduces all sorts of other complications where you're, raping a character who is another character, or you're killing a character who's another character. We're not going to. That is, I think, an easy problem to handle or think about after we've handled the harder question, which is when we're not dealing with hard online gaming. We're focusing on just playing games where the other characters are computer generated or computer run characters. So we'll focus on cases where the character murdered is controlled by the computer. So the person I'm killing is an NPC. It's a computer controlled character. The victim does not respawn, because you might want to say, well, they respawn, not a big deal. And the victim and the murderer are all adults. When we talk about virtual pedophilia, we're going to focus on cases where the character molested is controlled by the computer. So similarly, the victim is a child and the pedophile and the game player are adults. So the character in the game and the player are both adults. They are seducing and having sex with a computer-controlled character who's a child. So virtual pedophilia is going to be, or at least the case of virtual pedophilia we're dealing with are those. What arises here is what's been called the gamer's dilemma. And just really quick, what is a dilemma? A dilemma is when you're presented with two options and both are unacceptable. When faced with a dilemma, you can do either of two things. Which is itself a dilemma. You can either grab the dilemma by the horns and take one of the unacceptable options. So when I say you've got option A and option B, they both suck. What are you going to do? You might say, I'm going to take option A. That's grabbing the dilemma by the horns. Or you might say, I'm going to take option B. That's grabbing the dilemma by the horns. You agree, you accept the fact that you've got only two options and they both suck, and then you pick one, and maybe you try to explain why that one doesn't suck as much. The other thing you might do is that you show that this dilemma, the two options you've been presented with, is really a false dilemma. There's really a third option, or a fourth or fifth, but an option beyond those two. And we call that passing through the horns of the dilemma. And that's when you choose, when someone presents you, say, like, well, you either got to do this or that. What are you going to do? They both suck. And you say, you're fucking with me. There's a third option you're pretending doesn't exist. I'm going to do that. That's passing through the horns of the dilemma. So there are two ways we can respond to the gamer's dilemma. The gamer's dilemma is going to present us with two choices. We can either accept one of the two choices, or if we can discover and reveal a third option which we could choose instead. So what is the gamer's dilemma? Well, it is that if there is no morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, then either they're both morally wrong or they're both morally permissible. Why is this a dilemma? Why are both options unacceptable? Well, to say that virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are morally wrong, that's unacceptable because we don't generally think that there's anything wrong with playing Grand Theft Auto and screwing around and running over civilians, right? Engaging in virtual murder is something that we are usually, most of us, perfectly okay with. We see it as a very trivial thing. We either see it as a tiny moral wrong or something that like is not morally wrong at all and just kind of screwing around in a video game. But if we do that, if we say that about virtual murder, the claim is, well, there's no morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia. So then we have to say the same thing about virtual pedophilia. That, sure, pedophilia is wrong, raping a child, molesting a child is wrong, but like doing it in a video game, whatever, that's just blowing off steam, that's just screwing around in a video game, no one's being hurt, it doesn't matter. But the reason this is unacceptable or feels unacceptable is because what we want to say is that virtual murder in games like Grand Theft Auto is wrong, but is perfectly permissible. Perfectly okay. But virtual pedophilia, oh my God, what's wrong with you? Why are you? No, do not. Like we have a very strong reaction to virtual pedophilia, which we do not have to virtual murder. So the reason saying they're both wrong is unacceptable is because we want to say virtual murder is okay, and we want to say virtual pedophilia is wrong. I mean, even like very famous game marketplaces like Steam, they ban games which involve virtual pedophilia. They're perfectly fine with games that involve virtual murder. So, like, if they're both wrong, why is there that difference in the way that the Steam marketplace handles the games they sell? The other option is to say that they're both permissible. It's permissible to kill civilians for fun in GTA, which is exactly what we want to say. But then we have to also say it's perfectly fine to play these virtual pedophilia games, and we don't want to say that. The worry here is, the dilemma is, it seems like if we want to say things that are wrong in real life are wrong to do in video games, then we have to say the same thing about virtual murder in GTA as we say about virtual pedophilia. We don't want to say the same things about both of these. We want to say doing things in video games is not the same thing as real life. Virtual murder is fine. Virtual pedophilia is wrong. The dilemma is how can you consistently say that? Like, on what basis can we say that there is a morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia? That's what we're going to talk about. Like, possible solutions to the gamer's dilemma and whether we're forced to adopt one of these two solutions. So here's 5 possible solutions. One is social acceptability. Committing virtual murder is, for the most part, socially acceptable. Committing virtual pedophilia remains taboo. This is not a great response. The reading talks about how, it's not morally relevant. This difference of social acceptability is not morally relevant unless you're willing to reduce morality to mere social conventions. And that is not something that we want to do. When we talk about relativism and moral relativism, we'll talk about how wrong and how misguided that view turns out to be. So we don't want to think about morality as just a matter of social convention. So the fact that society approves of virtual murder but doesn't approve of virtual pedophilia, that's not a good grounds for making a moral difference between the two. And then, here's this quote here. Such an argument would be akin to asserting that, by virtue of the fact that slavery was socially acceptable within ancient Rome, it was also at that time moral. It was not at that time moral, and the morality or immorality of slavery does not depend on social acceptability. Neither does the morality or immorality of virtual murder or virtual pedophilia. So the fact that society is okay with one but not okay with the other, not a morally relevant difference, doesn't help us understand why we might think that one's okay and one's not okay. Another possible result, or another possibility, there's a likelihood to result in actual harm. So this is sort of a consequentialist or utilitarian sort of response. That here's how the argument might go: any act which is significantly likely to result in harm is immoral. Committing acts of virtual murder does not significantly raise the likelihood of committing actual murder, whereas committing acts of virtual pedophilia does significantly raise the likelihood of committing actual pedophilia. Therefore, conclusion, it is immoral to commit virtual pedophilia, but not necessarily virtual murder. Premise 2 here is problematic for a number of reasons. One is there's just not much empirical evidence, scientific evidence on what affects playing. There's no evidence about playing virtual pedophilia games, what effect that has on people. There is some studies of people with violent video games. There's not a consensus on it. I find it very hard to believe that violent video games cause violence. Clearly, people who do commit violence probably play video games. That can be either because everybody plays violent video games, or B, because people who are violent and commit violent acts tend to also enjoy that sort of thing. So it's not causing them to engage in violence. It's just another thing that stems from their personality. But beyond that, right? What does premise 2 say? Premise 2 says violent video games don't cause people to be violent, but virtual pedophilia games do cause people to be. There is just no studies on that whatsoever. So what you would need to establish this argument is both that some empirical evidence that virtual pedophilic games cause you to engage in pedophilia, but violent video games don't. There's just no. This is not the job of the philosopher. This is the job of the social scientist. So if this argument's going to succeed, we have to just wait for the results from social science to come back to us. Personally, from my own experience of life, I can't imagine that this argument's going to succeed. Another possible response is that is this enjoying the competition rather than the kill response. So when you enjoy virtual pedophilia, you enjoy committing virtual pedophilia itself. When you enjoy virtual murder, you're enjoying the competition, not the killing. Therefore, virtual pedophilia erodes your virtue, makes you a bad person. It starts making you enjoy bad things like raping a child, whereas virtual murder doesn't, because when you're playing video games that involve virtual murder, you're really just enjoying the competition, not the murder aspect. I like this response a little bit, but here's a couple problems. One is you could easily imagine a game that involves virtual pedophilia that's just for competition, like you have to steal a diamond in the game, and in order to steal a diamond, you need to seduce the 14-year-old daughter of whoever, right? maybe that's a response. The better response, I think, is there really no enjoyment that's derived from the virtual murder? It seems like when I play chess, you're right. I'm not like, when the pawn kills another piece, I'm not like, I murdered the bishop. That really, I got a thrill out of that. Sure. But chess is also a very removed, that is a purely competition strategy game. But when we play, Call of Duty or Battlefield 1, those games are graphic and becoming more graphic all the time. And it seems like the actual killing is a part of the fun. Particularly when someone screws around on GTA and is just running over civilians. They're not even playing for competition. They're just screwing around and killing people. So I don't buy the idea that you could make this distinction between, when you're killing in video games, it's always just a part of the competition, whereas when you're raping a child in a video game, it's never for competition. Both can be for competition. Both can be for their own sake. Therefore, it doesn't help us solve the gamer's dilemma, because the gamer's dilemma is presenting us with these two things need to be treated morally the same. What could be the difference between them? Doesn't seem like competition can be the difference between them. Okay. Another possible solution is that virtual pedophilia involves unfairly singling out a group for harm. Virtual pedophilia, but not virtual murder, unfairly singles out a particular group for harm. This argument seems to suggest that if a computer game allowed players to molest people of all different age groups, including children, it would not be morally permissible to play such a game. It doesn't seem like that sort of choice option suddenly makes... if we want to say that virtual murder is okay, but virtual pedophilia is wrong, it doesn't seem like if you just make a general molesting game, suddenly virtual pedophilia becomes okay. So this seems like a weird answer. Lastly, another response is that children have a special status. Children have a special moral status in virtue of their innocence, defenselessness, etc. So, other things being equal, harming a child is worse than harming an adult. Okay, worse than... maybe, I'm not sure if that's true, like murdering an adult versus raping a child, they seem like pretty equivalently the worst possible things you can do. But secondly, it implies that when you're playing Grand Theft Auto, here's my objection, when you're playing Grand Theft Auto and you're running over civilians, you run over an adult, you run over an adult, you run over an adult, and then you run over a child, and all of a sudden you've done something wrong? It doesn't seem like it's the singling out of children that matters here. So we're left with the gamer's dilemma. It doesn't seem like there's a morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia. So we have to treat them the same. We have to say that they're both wrong or they're both permissible. And the dilemma is that we want to say virtual murder, like in Grand Theft Auto, is okay, but we want to say virtual pedophilia is wrong, and the gamer's dilemma is that we can't do that. We have to treat them the same. So what bullet do we bite? Which is another way to say, which horn do we grab? What bad consequence do we accept? If we're stuck either saying they're both okay or they're both wrong, we don't want to accept either of those. What do we accept? So one possibility is to say that they're both wrong. Virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are wrong. One worry is that once you admit that virtual murder is wrong, you might need to admit that watching a movie or a TV show that depicts murder is wrong. So Pulp Fiction, Dexter, right? It seems like it expands beyond just video games. And now any sort of entertainment that involves murder is wrong. You might try to make to make this bullet biting, this grabbing this horn less unacceptable. You might use a distinction between active and passive mediums. So movies are a passive medium. Video games are an active medium. So maybe virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are both wrong in video games because you're actively doing it, but virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are both okay in film because it's a passive medium. It's also worrisome because it seems like if you make this active-passive distinction to say movies are okay, but video games aren't, now you're left with a weird consequence, which is that virtual murder, like murder in movies is bad, but like child pedophilia in movies is fine. You might say that child pedophilia in films is bad because it harms the child, because often the production of child pornography involves rape. But you could imagine, virtual, like some sort of AI like in the way that they produce Michael Jackson or Leia in the Star Wars films. You can produce a virtual actor for the film. There would be nothing wrong with that if we say that virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are wrong in video games because they're active, but movies are perfectly fine because they're passive. Then we're left saying virtual murder is fine in movies, but then we're left with this weird consequence that like computer-generated rapes of children, to watch those and enjoy them would be fine too because they're also passive. All right, so another bullet we could bite, right? Because a dilemma has two options. One is that virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are both wrong. The other way to go is to give up on our idea that they're different and say that they're both fine. They're both morally permissible. That violence and like running people over in Grand Theft Auto for fun is perfectly morally fine. There's nothing wrong with it. Sure, that's wrong to do in real life, but doing it in a video game is not doing it in real life. No one's being hurt. Doesn't lead you to hurt people, doesn't corrupt your soul, it's just mindless fun. You might say the same thing about virtual child pedophilia. Or we might just accept that that's true of both. They're both morally okay. Okay, so to move on, there's 4 more possible solutions to discuss, with the 4th being, I think, the best of the 4 for responding. Let me go back. Which bullet to bite? Personally, I think I would bite the second bullet. I alternate a little bit. I go back and forth because if I walk in on my buddy and it turns out he loves running random people over in Grand Theft Auto, I'm like, whatever, great for him. If I walk into my buddy and he's playing a game which involves seducing a child and raping them in a very graphic way, it's hard for me to think that there's not something fucked up about him. On the other hand, I can't solve this. I can't really solve this gamer's dilemma. It seems like no one's being hurt either way. I mean, child pedophilia is wrong because it hurts the kid. Child pornography hurts the kid because it hurts the kid in the production of the pornography. If it's all virtual, it's all a game, it's all cartoon, it's all AI generated, and you're just off on an island. Just imagine somebody who's playing this game on the moon. They are an astronaut on Mars. They're the only person there. They have left humanity behind, and they are playing child pedophilia games. There's no way they could harm anyone else. I find it a little hard to see what the problem is supposed to be. I can kind of see it. Tell you the truth, we're going to get to why we might have a problem with it. Okay. 4 more solutions to the gamer's dilemma, which might let us go through the horns and say one's okay, the other's not. Virtual child pornography will be used to seduce children. Levy responds, it may well be true that child pornography has been used in this way. However, it's implausible to think that it has ever made the crucial difference in the absence of which the child would have escaped abuse. So maybe these games are a way that pedophiles can use to groom children for abuse, but Levy, I think, plausibly responds, they would have done it some other way. If they had access to the child and ways to cover things, if they were in the sort of situation where they were able to do this, they would have done it a different way. It doesn't seem like virtual child pedophilia games really could have probably ever made the difference to whether a pedophile succeeded or didn't succeed in raping a child. Another possible response is allowing virtual child pornography makes laws banning real child pornography unenforceable. Levy, that's not true. It's not very difficult for experts to distinguish between virtual and actual pictures. That changes over time, but for the most part, I mean, if AI generated movies and actors become so good that the films of them can't be distinguished between the real thing, it's very easy for the producers of virtual child pornography or pedophilia games to record their whole production and release publicly how they made the game, to prove that the game is not all you would need is a law that says any sort of film of child pornography or any game that involves virtual child pedophilia is required to prove itself that it was virtual and produced in that way through AI rather than real life. And then you would be able to distinguish between the two, and you could have laws that distinguish between the two and ban one but don't ban the other. Additionally, if virtual child pornography is legal, pornographers will presumably abandon production of actual child images in favor of it, right? So this is a way of fighting child pornography. You might imagine that if you could produce this sort of pornography in a extremely accurate looking way that didn't actually involve a child, you could have a legal outfit producing it and selling it and not putting themselves at risk of 40 years of prison. They would presumably choose the virtual option over the real option if that was available. Presumably it will be available pretty soon. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Fourth possible solution, virtual pedophilia and virtual child pornography harms women. So this is the fourth response. This is the one that gives me the one that really gives me pause. I haven't given it a whole lot of thought. I find it somewhat convincing on its face. It's a weird. I mean, here's my response: virtual pedophilia, virtual pornography harms women, not the child, huh? Right? So it is a little bit of a weird, paradoxical answer here, because I'm not saying... So this response says there's no child being hurt in the production of virtual child pornography or virtual pedophilia, because it's all simulated. And it doesn't... We have no empirical evidence that encourages these pedophiles to engage in actual pedophilia. In fact, it might offer them a release, an alternative to actually abusing a child. So maybe the evidence is going to go the other way. So it doesn't seem like any child is harmed in this. It's not even like a child's youthful naked pictures got leaked and now pedophiles are masturbating to it. There's not even like in a way in which it might disrespect or use a real person or take their nudes and spread them around to people who take sexual pleasure in them from somebody who doesn't want that done. This is completely virtual. These are cartoon characters in the virtual pedophilia games. In the virtual child pornography, it's computer generated. Even if it's super accurate, there is no child that actually corresponds to the character in the movie. There is no child being harmed here. There's also no woman being harmed. So how can this response saying it's harming women? All right, so let's look. This is the sort of surprising response, which I have come to be a little bit more sympathetic. I mean, I was also like, what the fuck are they talking about when I first started reading this response? The idea here is eroticizing inequality reinforces gender inequality in society. So it presents women as naturally assuming and subordinate position in sex. Men are encouraged to think of themselves as active, penetrating subjects, women to conceive of themselves as penetrated objects. This has effects on women as well upon men. Women, as much as men, have their sexuality shaped by social norms, and when these norms dictate that sexuality is inherently an unequal transaction that is sexy because it's unequal, and that women are naturally suited for the subordinate role in this transaction, then women and men cannot help but absorb the message at least somewhat. The eroticization of inequality has effects beyond the bounds of sexuality, encouraging both men and women to think of women as naturally inferior in other areas of life as well. Okay. Is there any empirical evidence of this? So there's this causal impact that's being proposed, maybe on the unconscious, about your attitudes and beliefs towards women, not necessarily your behavior, but your attitudes towards them. Is there any sort of empirical evidence that this is true? Well, there is a lot of empirical evidence about implicit biases, right? So if you ask people to categorize as possibly a threat or not a threat by their pictures, and you flash up pictures of white people and black people, and they have 2 seconds, click left, click right, depending on whether they're a threat or not a threat. If you read these people's stories of black people accomplishing great feats, doing, in wartime, performing heroic acts, or discovering cures, or doing great scientific research, when they do that sort of sorting, they do better. They're less biased. They don't classify black people as a threat as much as they do when you don't. So if you just present people with this sort of sorting activity, usually they have a bias towards black people being a threat, right? They might say, I'm not racist. I think black, skin is just a pigment, in your surface. There's nothing whether you're black or white, it says nothing about you. A lot of those people, when you stick them in front of the game, the activity where they have to sort faces between a threat or not in 2 seconds, they still tend to sort the black faces as threatening more often than the white faces. So they have this sort of implicit unconscious bias towards black people being a threat. Even if explicitly, if you ask them, they would say all sorts of things about how they're not biased at all. Black people are in no way more likely to be threatening than white people. But the sort of rapid fire activity reveals that there's some unconscious force that's pressuring them to think that black people are a threat. If you tell them these sorts of stories before you ask them to do the sorting activity, this effect is mitigated. They tend to do this less. They tend to not be as biased against black faces being threatening. So the idea here is the messages that film, entertainment, games, society, the things that we see do have an implicit effect, an unconscious effect on our minds. So maybe pornography that eroticizes inequality does have this. I mean, this is a stretch, right? This is a real empirical stretch to move from implicit biases about sorting black faces to the idea that watching pornography that presents the sexual encounters between men and women as unequal, or any sort of unequal sexual encounter, will affect our unconscious. I find it on its face a little plausible. So I think that it's right to say that the empirical evidence needs to be more robust here. But, the idea, like the sort of pornography that portrays, so for example, a woman going into a mall and shoplifting and then being caught by the mall security and brought to the back room and then coerced into sex in order to get out. I mean, the sort of way in which people can find that erotic, the sort of coercive pressuring people into sex, that does seem like that probably has a bad effect on you, on your attitudes towards women, on your attitudes towards sex. And I guess I buy it on its face, but I do think that the empirical, to a certain extent, this does depend on empirical evidence coming out to support this sort of view. What does this have to do with virtual child pornography and virtual pedophilia? Well, child pornography is necessarily inegalitarian, right? It's necessarily a power dynamic of a powerful person coercing somebody who doesn't know what they're getting involved in, who can't make consensual choices, who is in an unequal position in society and getting off. So when I gave you but adult pornography is only contingently inegal. There is plenty of adult pornography which is consensual, which is non-coercive, which is perfectly fine, right? There doesn't seem to be any moral problem with pornography, as far as I can tell. Like, we think about utilitarianism, think about Kantian ethics, think about virtue ethics. Doesn't seem like, maybe when you're in a relationship, watching pornography has a detrimental effect on your commitment to your partner, involves thinking about other people. It, poisons your sex life. You can tell if there is a problem with pornography, it's much more akin to smoking and drinking than it is to lying and cheating. Like, it is something that's bad for you, maybe, but not necessarily like betraying someone else, unless, of course, you've promised your partner that you won't watch pornography. And pornography can be loving, it can be consensual, it can be all of those things. But it can also be coercive and rapey. And the claim here is that harms you. It corrupts your virtue. It corrupts your attitudes towards others. It's leads you to take the wrong attitudes towards other people. It eroticizes inequality. And that adult pornography is wrong, while other adult pornography is okay. The problem with child pornography is it's always of the rapey sort. It's always someone coercing an unequal partner and taking advantage of them. It's always like, so child pornography is wrong in the same way that any of the pornography. I mean, what this shows, I think, is that, I mean, the sort of pornography that where it's coercive, that sort of mall cop forcing a shoplifter into sex, that is an incredibly popular genre of adult pornography. The claim here would be that that is wrong, and as wrong as virtual child pornography. Real child pornography is much worse. Real child pornography involves the actual raping of a child in the production of the video, and so it actually harms a child. Virtual child pornography doesn't, but it's wrong. It would be wrong in the same way as that sort of pornography that eroticizes taking advantage of somebody. If either of them are wrong, it seems like they would be wrong on the same grounds. So obtaining equal status for all women requires a new sexuality, a sexuality in which inequality is not a condition of sexual pleasure for men or women. It requires that sexual relations be conducted between equals. But since child pornography is necessarily an eroticization of inequality, allowing it undermines efforts to forge this new sexuality. Perhaps then it is because of the harm to actual women and not children, because children are in fact not equal to adults, that virtual child pornography is objectionable. So that's our fourth possible solution. I find this very provocative and interesting as a solution to the gamer's dilemma. I still think my inclination for solving the gamer's dilemma is to grab one of the horns which is to say that they're both permissible. But I find this sort of critique that hinges on the harm to women somewhat plausible. I don't know. I'm really uncertain on my response here. So here we've got the gamer's dilemma. I want you to think about this. I'm going to end here. This is the last slide. What the fuck is the difference between committing, virtual murder, killing people for fun is wrong in real life. Raping a child in real life is wrong. Both of them are wrong. So what about doing them in video games? Well, it seems like I can either say, well, they're wrong in real life, so they're wrong in video games, so they're both wrong. That doesn't seem like a great result. Or I can say they're both okay. Well, now I have to say games where you rape a child are okay. That also doesn't seem okay. So then I need if I don't want to accept either of those horns of the dilemma, I need some sort of way of saying what's the morally relevant difference between the two. We've gone through a bunch of them. I think maybe the most plausible thing to do is to focus on this eroticization of the inequality response. Maybe that doesn't work either. In fact, if you made me bet right now, I would probably bet it doesn't work, and that we're left saying both of these things are morally permissible. I don't know. I leave it up to you to think about and hopefully post about what answer to the gamer's dilemma do you think is correct.